Sandra Levy, the head of television, rang and said she wanted to see me at Gore Hill. So I drove over there, and on the bridge, it suddenly struck me that this could be about Media Watch. But I couldn't accept the job because I had a book to write, and I knew that as I walked into the room, and I accepted the job.
Why did you accept the job?
Media Watch is a terrific program. I've always been a fan of the show, and being the presenter of Media Watch is one of the best jobs in television.
What's the role of Media Watch?
Media Watch is the scourge of bad journalism. Media Watch speaks for the viewers and readers and listeners of newspapers, television, radio. It speaks for them by being highly skilled, completely tough judges of rotten journalism, and gives the public, through that, huge pleasure. Unlike my predecessor Paul Barry, most of our battles were with the outside world, not with the ABC. Our battles were with the people we were criticising, with the Australian, with other newspapers, with television stations. There were some blues with the ABC, but that was not the whole agenda.
Now, the Chris Mitchells and David Pemberthys of the world believe that you were too left-wing for the job and that it was time for a right-wing presenter.
The notion that we were left-wingers on some kind of left-wing crusade with Media Watch always fell down when you asked people to define what these left-wingers were and how you could identify, a left-wing criticism of plagiarism. How was it different from, say, a right-wing criticism of plagiarism? That was really just ideological bullying to defend their own positions and their own mistakes.
Andrew Bolt said that there needed to be a cultural change at Media Watch and a willingness to employ not a David Marr, but a me. Journalists and commentators pinged for stupidities and mistakes had a bit of a habit of putting up an ideological barrier and claiming that they were right-wingers oppressed by a left-wing cabal of critics. It doesn't really wash because, when you get things wrong, when you're caught plagiarising, when you're caught just being stupid, the ideological defence looks particularly shabby, I think, to the audience of Media Watch. They can see that we've got our targets. And to be told that we shouldn't have shot in that direction because we are, gasp, left-wingers, whatever that means, just looks ridiculous. What about Andrew Bolt? What sort of presenter would Andrew Bolt make, do you think?
Andrew Bolt is excellent television. Whether he would be able to put in the hard yards of researching complex media stories and getting to the nub of the errors, mistakes involved in them, I don't know. I don't think so. That's not his game. His game is to be... he sings songs in his columns. He sings arias often of hatred and rage. But that's not Media Watch. Media Watch is analysis. We have to prove everything we do on television, and we have to prove it almost at once. There's no time. We have to present the proof. That's not really Andrew's bag. And then came Cash for Comment 2, which revealed that really nothing much had changed since Richard Ackland did the greatest gotcha of the history of Media Watch and exposed the whole scheme of Cash for Comment.
Fabulous. Now, Cash for Comment 2, can you talk about the big break when you got the document in the pot plant in the cafe near the ABC and what that was, the fact that it was the regulators report into Alan Jones' relationship with Telstra?
Alan Jones was clearly spruiking for Telstra on air, and the Australian Communications Authority did an inquiry that let him off the hook. We couldn't believe it. Then we got a phone call that if we went to a certain cafe, there would be in the pot plant a report, the earlier report, the report that had nailed Jones, the report that had been quashed by David Flint. That document was important because it showed there was a deep division within the Australian Communications Authority about how to handle Jones. There were those in there who were willing to go in tough and really tell it as it was, but that Jones was being protected. This was the report that had been quashed. Jones was being protected. It made a huge impact, and it's no wonder that Macquarie Broadcasting went to such lengths to try to stop us putting it on air. I got a phone call to say that there was a very interesting letter, a letter that David Flint had written to Jones in the middle of an important investigation of Jones, expressing his admiration for the broadcaster. Were we interested? I said, yes, we were very interested. The person who had the letter and I had an acquaintance in common. So the idea was that the letter would be sent through this person. Unfortunately, the letter was sent to the house over the road, barely addressed. But the neighbour thought, oh, my mate over the road might know David Marr, and took it over. And it came to us at the last minute. The whole operation nearly failed on a wrong address. We were worried about the letter because it had an error of grammar in the first paragraph. And we had to decide whether David Flint was the kind of man who might make a pretty obvious mistake in his grammar. We thought about this for a while and we decided, yes, the letter was genuine.
Now, David Flint dismisses that letter. He says the fact that you admire someone surely doesn't mean you cannot see their transgressions.
And of course, it was the second time he'd done it, because in the first huge cash for comment inquiry, he'd actually gone on air with one of the broadcasters being investigated. He'd gone on air to spruik for a book that he was publishing. David Flint didn't seem to understand that the public office was what mattered, not his private opinions.
What credit did Media Watch take for David Flint's resignation from the Australian Broadcasting Authority?
The publication of the letter left David Flint with no prestige at all. He was just a joke after that. And he had to go, and it was remarkable really that he survived for, I think, 2 or 3 months before he finally called a press conference and announced that he was retiring. But we did that. But it was the straw. It was the straw that broke that strange camel's back. We, of course, handed out awards of our own, notably the Barra, the mighty Barra, which was short for the Campbell Reed Perpetual Trophy for the brazen recycling of other people's work. It was instituted after Campbell Reed's Daily Telegraph was just plagiarising and plagiarising. And it was instituted, of course, after Campbell Reed sent us the famous fish.
Now, what was the significance of sending the fish in mafia culture?
In mafia culture, the fish means that you are about to join the fishes of the deep. So when this fish turned up, we were expecting the worst. We loved it. We loved the fish. The problem was we nearly called it a trout on air. But luckily at the last minute, somebody went round to the Chatswood fish shop and had it checked out, and we were assured it was in fact a barramundi, so it became the mighty Barra.
Whose idea was the award, and how did Campbell Reed react to the award in his name?
The name of the award was just a florid joke of mine, and Campbell Reed took it quite well. It didn't immediately stamp out plagiarism in the Daily Telegraph, but it went some way to doing so, and he rolled with that particular punch.
Now look, it's hard to answer this briefly, but what were the culture wars, and why was Media Watch considered a small but important part of it?
The culture wars were a thuggish attempt to silence critics by smearing them with ideological labels, and also at the same time to demand places at the table by some people with really extreme views on the grounds that balance required these bizarre viewpoints to be represented, radio, television, newspapers. And that's fair enough. I mean, let there be a million voices. But the agenda was to remove the critical voices, the ones they didn't like. And so the notion was there were too many left-wingers at the ABC, too many left-wingers in newspapers. There were too many left-wingers everywhere and not enough of them. And essentially, the culture wars were an ugly kind of employment scheme for commentators with bizarre points of view. And now it just looks like the most ancient history. It's just all over.
Why was Media Watch considered a small but important part of the culture wars?
Media Watch's agenda for pointing out stupidities and ridiculousnesses and errors often took them to extreme columnists who were themselves pursuing this bogus war on the left. And that was just, the agenda of Media Watch. We went where the stupidity was, and there was a lot of it out there. So naturally, their reply, rather than sort of admitting their errors, confessing their faults and mending their ways, their reply was to try to turn this into a kind of political ideological battle, when in fact it was a battle about professional standards.
After 9/11, there were certain issues that defined the cultural wars. The war on terror, Iraq, anti-Muslim stories, all things that Media Watch covered.
9/11 released a lot of hate and fear into the community, and that was naturally reflected in the press. And one of the things we did a lot of in the following year when Media Watch came back on air was to criticise the excesses of those people who were peddling false stories of fear and hatred. It became an important part of our agenda, and particularly because in Australia at that time there was some very ugly reporting of Muslim issues.
You said to me that your time was really defined by your clashes with the Australian. Is that something you...
We found at Media Watch that everyone in the end could take it. We could criticise newspapers and radio stations. We could criticise the ABC very strongly, and nobody liked it, but they could take it. The only people who really couldn't take it was the Australian. The Australian hated it, and they fought back very strongly, and they just can't cope with being criticised. Classically, they're the great disher out, and they can't bear being dished.
Right, now who is Janet Albrechtsen, and what does it mean to Albrecht?
To Albrecht is to lift and twist other people's words. Janet Albrechtsen was a mere columnist when our attention turned to her, but when we discovered that she was actually lifting people's analysis of gang rape in Europe and twisting it to the purpose of attacking Muslim youth, she became a cause. We made Janet Albrechtsen. She'd be simply writing columns for the Australian today, but for Media Watch. We criticised Janet Albrechtsen because she was wrong, because she misused the work of a couple of European academics to pursue her own argument. And those academics, when alerted to what she had written, dissented strongly from her use of their names. It was not an ideological battle. She tried an ideological defence. This was simply bad journalism.
Janet Albrechtsen has claimed that Media Watch resorts to reprehensible reprehensible means to shut down debate and smear the reputations of those with opinions it dislikes. It's a parody of upholding journalistic standards.
If Media Watch was remotely guilty of the crimes that Janet Albrechtsen alleges, no one would watch it. The show would not survive. It would have no audience. Media Watch only survives because we prove our cases on air and because therefore we're trusted. That's why it survives.
Now, Chris Mitchell, argues that Media Watch concentrated more on the Australian than it did on Fairfax, particularly the Herald.
There was often the notion that we should apportion our attention according to the size of the newspaper segment and the number of television stations. Well, this was an argument often put by News Limited, and I could never work out why. Because News Limited controls something like 60% of the newspapers in Australia. Does that mean Media Watch had to spend 60% of its time when looking at newspapers getting stuck into News Limited? Very strange. But the other thing is, they would say, our critics would say from time to time, oh, you're being gentle on Fairfax, or oh, you're being gentle on the ABC. And we kept saying to them this, show us the stories we missed. Now, I'm not saying we didn't at times miss stories. We missed stories in the Australian from time to time. A little weekly show, you have to make hard choices about what you actually spend your time on. But no one in my time came up with a list of great snafus and errors at Fairfax that we had ideologically turned a blind eye to. It's just a fantasy.
Now, I'm told that Media Watch is the only program of its type in the world, and it's very special for that it's the only program that actually criticises not only commercial media but its own organisation.
We're told that there's nothing like Media Watch in the world, and journalists who come here from America, come here from Britain, come here from Europe, look at the show in wonderment. They can't believe that something as wide-ranging and tough could be put on national television, criticising the whole of the press, including, as it must of course, the station that hosts the show itself. They say, why can't we have it back in our own countries? And I ask that question too, but no one back there seems to have the courage, and seems to have the kind of grit to put on a show that will, right across the board, crit the media.
Just how fearless does a presenter have to be on Media Watch?
Presenters, of course, are protected by their executive producers from the rough and tumble of life. You've got to make hard choices and you lose a couple of friends along the way, but I'm not for a moment claiming that it's a job that requires enormous courage